In the winter of 1899, Kansas endured the most savage cold ever recorded in its history. Temperatures crashed to -40 degrees Fahrenheit and snow buried entire homesteads for months on end. But in the small town of Hayes, something far more chilling than the weather itself was unfolding behind the doors of the Parker Brothers warehouse. When spring finally came and the snow began to melt, investigators uncovered discrepancies in the county death records that would haunt them for decades to come. Over 300 families had supposedly perished during the brutal winter. Yet only 47 bodies were ever recovered from the town cemetery. The rest had simply vanished without a single trace. What the Parker brothers were feeding into their industrial furnaces wasn't merely wood or coal. It was evidence of the most methodical and calculating crime spree in Kansas history, concealed beneath the cover of Christian charity and community service. Before we reveal the disturbing truth about what Thomas and Samuel Parker did during those frozen months, I want you to understand that this story contains details that have been buried deep in county archives for over a century. If you're drawn to true crime stories that blur the boundary between fact and legend, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments which state you're listening from. I genuinely love to know how far this story travels. The documents I'm about to share with you were found in a water-damaged basement of the Hayes County Courthouse. And what they reveal will permanently alter how you think about survival, desperation, and the darkest corners of human nature. The year 1899 began with promise for the people of Hayes, Kansas. This railroad town of roughly 8,000 souls had weathered difficult winters before, and the community took pride in its neighborly cooperation and Christian values. The town sat strategically along the Kansas Pacific Railway, which brought both prosperity and a constant flow of settlers looking to claim their share of the American frontier. Main Street buzzed with activity. The general store, the bank, 3 churches, and dozens of businesses serving the surrounding farming communities. But Hayes was also a town built on the very edge of the unknown. Just 30 miles west lay the beginning of what locals called the Empty Lands. Vast stretches of prairie where homesteaders had staked out isolated plots, often miles from their nearest neighbors. These determined families had built their lives in sod houses and wooden shanties, depending entirely on their own resourcefulness and occasional supply runs into town for survival. Thomas and Samuel Parker had arrived in Hayes 5 years earlier, in 1894, carrying enough capital to purchase a large warehouse on the outskirts of town. The brothers, then in their early 30s, presented themselves as entrepreneurs with a clear vision for serving the growing community. Thomas, the elder brother, was tall and lean with prematurely gray hair and the kind of piercing blue eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they rested upon. Samuel was shorter and stockier, with calloused hands and a permanent smile that never quite reached his eyes. Their business model was straightforward yet essential. They offered cleaning and estate services for families in crisis. When homesteaders died from accidents, disease, or the brutal realities of frontier life, the Parker brothers would step in to handle the difficult aftermath. They would travel to the deceased family's property, remove bodies for proper burial, inventory, and sell personal belongings, clean the homestead, and prepare it for new occupants. In an era when death was common and resources were scarce, their services filled a crucial void. The brothers had built a reputation for discretion and efficiency. They owned 2 heavy wagons, employed several part-time workers, and maintained one of the few large furnaces in the region. Originally installed to process salvage materials and dispose of unsellable items, local families trusted them to handle their most painful moments with dignity and respect. As autumn gave way to winter in 1899, few could have predicted that nature was about to deliver the most devastating blow in Kansas history. The first snows arrived in early November, weeks earlier than usual. By December, temperatures had plunged to levels that old-timers claimed they had never witnessed before. The railroad lines became unreliable. Supply runs to isolated homesteads grew dangerous, and the town of Hayes found itself increasingly cut off from the outside world. But Thomas and Samuel Parker saw opportunity where everyone else saw catastrophe. They had survived previous winters by adapting their methods, and they possessed resources that most of their neighbors simply lacked. What nobody understood was that the brothers had been quietly refining their approach to their macabre business, finding ways to extract maximum profit from human tragedy. The brutal winter of 1899 would give them unprecedented opportunity to perfect those methods. The first sign that this winter would be unlike any other came on November 18, 1899, when temperatures plummeted 30 degrees overnight. Sarah Henderson, who operated the telegraph office, later wrote in her diary that she had never seen ice form so rapidly on the windows. By morning, the town square sat buried under 18 inches of snow, and the wind howled with a ferocity that made outdoor conversation impossible. Within days, the railroad announced that service would be suspended indefinitely. Supply wagons from the east stopped arriving, and families scattered across the prairie found themselves completely cut off. The Parker brothers, however, appeared remarkably well prepared for the crisis. Their warehouse was stocked with coal, preserved foods, and warm clothing. They had arranged for their furnace to be converted to burn multiple types of fuel, and they possessed the only reliable winter transportation in the area, a specially reinforced sled built to cut through deep snow. As December wore on, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Families began appearing at the Parker brothers' warehouse seeking help with heating fuel, food, or transportation into town. Thomas and Samuel welcomed these visitors with apparent compassion, offering shelter and assistance. However, those who worked closely with the brothers began noticing subtle shifts in their behavior. Mary Kellerman, who served as the town's informal record keeper, later testified that the Parker brothers had visited her office repeatedly throughout December, asking detailed questions about property ownership, inheritance laws, and the procedures involved in transferring land titles. They claimed to be planning ahead for the estate services they would undoubtedly need once the winter broke. At the time, Mary found their preparation admirable. Only later would she grasp the true purpose behind their inquiries. The brothers also began making regular visits to isolated homesteads, supposedly to check on families and offer assistance. They would arrive carrying supplies, warm clothing, and cheerful conversation. But according to witness accounts uncovered decades later, these visits frequently preceded mysterious disappearances. The Kowalski family, who lived 12 miles north of Hayes, received a visit from the Parker brothers on December 14. Neighbors found their homestead abandoned just 3 days later, with no indication of where the family had gone. The brothers claimed they had helped the Kowalskis relocate to relatives in Missouri, but no such relatives were ever found. As Christmas approached, the temperature sank to an unimaginable low of -38 degrees. The town's population began shrinking as families either fled eastward or simply vanished. The Parker brothers, meanwhile, appeared to thrive amid the chaos. Their furnace burned without pause, pushing thick black smoke into the gray sky. The smell drifting from their warehouse was unlike anything the townspeople had ever encountered before, a sickly sweet odor that clung to clothing and lingered in the nostrils long after. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the town's physician, made several attempts to investigate the source of the smell. Each time he approached the warehouse, however, he was politely but firmly turned away by the brothers, who claimed they were burning contaminated materials from homes where families had died of disease. Given the circumstances, Dr. Hartwell accepted this explanation, though he recorded in his medical journal that the odor was unlike any disease-related material he had encountered throughout his entire practice. By New Year's Day 1900, the situation had taken on a surreal quality. The town of Hayes, which had boasted 8,000 residents just 2 months earlier, now appeared to house fewer than 2,000 souls. The Parker brothers claimed that most families had either died from the cold or fled to warmer regions. They had taken on the enormous task of processing abandoned properties, working day and night to salvage what they could and prepare homes for eventual resettlement. But a handful of observant residents had begun to notice troubling patterns. Properties that had been abandoned were somehow being transferred to new owners with unusual speed. Valuable items belonging to deceased families were turning up in the brothers' warehouse for sale, often within days of the supposed deaths. Most disturbing of all, the brothers seemed to possess an uncanny ability to predict which families would disappear next. The first person to voice serious concern about the Parker brothers was Janet Thornfield, a widow who operated a small boarding house near the center of town. Janet had lived in Hayes for over 20 years and prided herself on knowing virtually every family within a 50-mile radius. As the winter deepened, she began keeping careful notes about the families who had supposedly died or fled. Her records, uncovered in 1962 during the renovation of her former boarding house, paint a disturbing portrait of systematic deception. According to Janet's notes, the Parker brothers were reporting family deaths at a rate that defied all statistical probability. During December and January alone, they claimed to have processed the estates of 43 families, ranging from elderly couples to households with young children. Yet Janet's careful observations revealed that many of these families had been in good health and possessed adequate supplies the last time she had seen them. The Brennan family, for example, had visited Janet's boarding house on December 20th, appearing well-fed and in good spirits. Mrs. Brennan had even purchased supplies for what she described as a comfortable winter in their homestead. Yet just 5 days later, the Parker brothers reported that the entire family had frozen to death in their home. When Janet asked to pay her respects at the funeral, she was told that the bodies had been too badly damaged by the cold for a proper viewing and had been buried immediately. Similar discrepancies surrounded the fate of the Williamson family, the Krause family, and nearly a dozen others. In each case, the Parker brothers offered reasonable explanations for the deaths and handled all arrangements with apparent professionalism. But Janet's notes reveal a consistent pattern of healthy families suddenly vanishing, followed by the rapid liquidation of their properties and possessions. Janet's suspicions deepened further when she witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. On the evening of January 15, 1900, she was walking past the Parker brothers' warehouse when she heard voices coming from inside. Through a gap in the wooden siding, she glimpsed what appeared to be a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children, standing near the furnace. The family seemed to be in visible distress, and Thomas Parker was speaking to them in low, urgent tones. Janet couldn't make out the words, but she clearly heard the woman crying and one of the children asking, "When can we go home?" Janet waited nearly an hour, expecting to see the family emerge from the warehouse. Instead, she heard the furnace door open and close several times, followed by the sound of heavy objects being moved. When she finally gathered the courage to look through the gap again, she saw only Thomas and Samuel Parker working methodically to feed materials into the furnace. The family was nowhere to be seen. The following morning, Janet made discreet inquiries about the family she had witnessed. The description she provided matched the Hendricks family, who had been reported as frozen to death in their homestead 2 days earlier. When Janet expressed confusion about having seen them alive the previous evening, she was told she must have been mistaken. Grief and worry, the brothers explained sympathetically, could play cruel tricks on the mind during such difficult times. But Janet was absolutely certain of what she had seen. She began paying much closer attention to the Parker brothers' activities, tracking their comings and goings and noting the patterns in their behavior. What she discovered was a level of organization and efficiency that seemed impossible for a legitimate estate service. Through careful observation and testimony later gathered from surviving witnesses, a picture emerged of how the Parker brothers had transformed their lawful business into something far more sinister. Their approach was methodical, calculated, and engineered to exploit both the desperation of winter and the trust of their community. The brothers had developed what could only be described as a systematic process for acquiring properties and disposing of their owners. They would begin by identifying vulnerable families, those who lived in isolation, held valuable possessions, or lacked strong connections to the broader community. They would then make contact under the pretense of offering assistance, using their reputation and resources to gain the family's trust. Once they had established that relationship, the brothers would gradually deepen the family's dependence on their services. They would provide heating fuel, food, and transportation, always presenting themselves as generous benefactors. However, according to evidence uncovered later, they were actually engineering conditions that made the families more vulnerable and isolated. The brothers had acquired detailed knowledge of property law and inheritance procedures, enabling them to forge documents and manipulate official records. They had also cultivated relationships with key individuals in the county administration, securing advance notice of property transfers and legal proceedings. Most importantly, they had perfected methods for eliminating evidence that left virtually no trace of their activities. When the moment came to eliminate a family, the brothers would lure them to the warehouse under some pretext, often claiming they had located relatives who could provide help or that they needed assistance with estate matters. Once the family was inside the warehouse, they would be overpowered and killed. The brothers had engineered their furnace to burn at extremely high temperatures, allowing them to dispose of bodies entirely while simultaneously destroying any personal effects that might have been traced back to the victims. The genius of their system was that it operated entirely within the context of legitimate business activity. The brothers were already known as estate cleaners and property processors, so the presence of personal belongings in their warehouse raised no suspicion. The continuous operation of their furnace was explained as necessary for disposing of contaminated materials and unsellable items. Even the smell drifting from their operations could be attributed to burning organic materials from abandoned homes. Dr. Hartwell's medical journal, discovered in 1978, offers additional insight into the brothers' methods. The doctor noted that throughout the winter of 1899 to 1900, he was never once called to examine any of the bodies the Parker brothers claimed to have found. In every case, he was told the bodies had been too badly damaged by cold or disease to warrant medical examination. This was highly irregular, as Dr. Hartwell was normally involved in determining cause of death for insurance and legal purposes. The brothers had also built an efficient system for liquidating stolen property. They would sort through their victims' belongings, keeping valuable items for later sale and burning anything that could be traced to specific individuals. They maintained detailed inventories of their acquisitions, which they would later claim represented legitimate purchases or salvage operations. Most disturbing of all, the brothers appear to have constructed psychological mechanisms for justifying their actions. In letters found among Thomas Parker's personal effects, he described their activities as mercy work and claimed they were sparing families from the suffering they would have endured throughout the harsh winter. Samuel Parker's diary, uncovered decades later, contains entries suggesting he genuinely believed they were rendering a service to the community by preventing slow deaths from starvation and freezing. By mid-January 1900, the Parker brothers had reached the peak of their efficiency. The temperature had not climbed above -20 degrees in over 3 weeks, and the town of Hayes was essentially severed from the outside world. Under these conditions, the brothers operated with near-complete impunity, confident their activities would go unnoticed and uninvestigated. During this period, they processed what they later claimed were the estates of over 60 families. The mathematical impossibility of this number should have triggered immediate suspicion, but the extreme conditions made normal oversight impossible. The county courthouse was frequently inaccessible due to snow, the railroad remained suspended, and communication with state authorities was virtually cut off. The brothers had also sharpened their selection process to focus on families with the most valuable properties and possessions. They maintained detailed records of land ownership, livestock holdings, and stored goods, allowing them to prioritize targets based on potential profit. They had developed the ability to forge property transfer documents with remarkable skill, often completing transactions that would normally have required weeks of legal proceedings. Evidence suggests that during this peak period, the brothers were processing multiple families each week. Their warehouse operated around the clock, with the furnace burning continuously and workers moving materials in and out at all hours. The brothers had recruited several accomplices from among the town's most desperate residents, offering food and shelter in exchange for assistance with their estate services. These accomplices, who were likely unaware of the full scope of the brothers' activities, later provided crucial testimony when the truth finally came to light. They described a warehouse filled with personal belongings, furniture, and household goods from dozens of families. They watched the brothers sort through clothing, toys, and personal items with the efficiency of seasoned merchants. Most tellingly, they reported that the brothers maintained detailed lists of names, addresses, and property descriptions that they updated constantly. One accomplice, a man named Frank Collar, later testified that he had been employed to help move salvage materials from the warehouse to the furnace. He described carrying bundles of clothing, furniture, and what he believed to be contaminated bedding from abandoned homes. However, he noted that many of the items appeared to be in excellent condition, and some seemed to contain personal effects that no family would have willingly left behind. Frank also reported that the brothers maintained strict control over access to certain areas of the warehouse. There were rooms workers were forbidden to enter in times when all employees were required to vacate the premises entirely. The brothers explained these restrictions as necessary for handling contaminated materials or processing sensitive estate documents. But Frank later understood that these were almost certainly the times when the brothers were disposing of bodies. The efficiency of the operation was matched only by its secrecy. The brothers had developed an elaborate web of explanations and cover stories for every aspect of their activities. They maintained correspondence with fictional relatives of deceased families, created false departure notices for families who had supposedly fled to other states, and even arranged for periodic letters from families supposedly alive and well in distant locations. The first crack in the Parker brothers' seemingly flawless system came from an entirely unexpected source. A child's toy that should have been burned months earlier. On February 14, 1900, a young girl named Emma Schultz was playing near the warehouse when she found a small wooden horse partially buried in the snow. The toy was hand-carved and bore the initials PB Peter Brennan, the 6-year-old son of the family that had supposedly frozen to death in December. Emma brought the toy to her mother, who recognized it immediately as belonging to the Brennan family. Mrs. Schultz had seen Peter playing with that horse just days before the family's reported death, and she knew it was his most treasured possession. The notion that the toy would have been discarded or left behind seemed impossible. Peter would never have parted with it voluntarily. Mrs. Schultz shared her concerns with Janet Thornfield, who had been quietly documenting her own suspicions about the Parker brothers. Together, they began to investigate more systematically, comparing notes and observations about the families that had supposedly died or fled during the winter. What they found was a pattern of discrepancies that could not be explained away by coincidence or confusion. The two women realized they needed help, but approaching the local authorities seemed like an impossible task. The sheriff, Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan, no relation to the deceased family, was overwhelmed by the crisis and had been relying heavily on the Parker brothers' reports about deaths and disappearances. The county judge was effectively unreachable due to the snow, and state authorities were managing similar crises throughout Kansas. Instead, Janet and Mrs. Schultz decided to recruit other concerned residents to help with their investigation. They approached Dr. Hartwell, who had been troubled by his inability to examine any of the bodies the brothers claimed to have discovered. They also contacted Mary Kellerman, the record keeper, who had grown uncomfortable with the brothers' repeated inquiries about property law and inheritance procedures. This small group of investigators began meeting in secret to compare their observations and document their concerns. They found that each of them had noticed different aspects of the Parker brothers' suspicious behavior, but when combined, the evidence painted a deeply unsettling picture of systematic deception and possible criminal activity. Dr. Hartwell contributed medical expertise, noting that reported causes of death were often inconsistent with the supposed circumstances. Mary Kellerman provided insight into the legal irregularities surrounding property transfers and estate settlements. Janet Thornfield offered detailed observations about the brothers' activities and schedules. Mrs. Schultz contributed her personal knowledge of the affected families and their circumstances. Together, they began assembling a timeline of events that challenged every aspect of the brothers' official account. They identified families who had supposedly died but whose circumstances made death highly unlikely. They documented property transfers that had occurred with impossible speed. They noted the absence of bodies, funerals, and the standard procedures that should have accompanied so many deaths. Most importantly, they began forming a theory about what was actually happening to the missing families. The constant operation of the furnace, the strange odors, the brothers' access to isolated families, and the deeply systematic nature of the disappearances all pointed toward a conclusion that was almost too horrifying to contemplate. Armed with their evidence and a growing certainty about the Parker brothers' crimes, the group faced a crucial decision. They could continue gathering evidence and hope that spring would bring outside authorities capable of conducting a proper investigation, or they could take immediate action to prevent further deaths. The decision was effectively made for them when they learned the brothers were planning to visit the Kowalski family, one of the last remaining isolated homesteads in the area. On the evening of February 22, 1900, Dr. Hartwell and Janet Thornfield decided to follow the Parker brothers on their visit to the Kowalski homestead. They traveled by sled, staying far enough behind to avoid detection but close enough to observe the brothers' movements. What they witnessed that night would provide the final confirmation of their worst fears. The brothers arrived at the Kowalski homestead around sunset, carrying supplies and presenting themselves as concerned neighbors. They were welcomed warmly by the family, who had been isolated for weeks and were deeply grateful for the contact. Dr. Hartwell and Janet watched from a distance as the brothers entered the home and remained inside for several hours. Around midnight, the brothers emerged from the house with the entire Kowalski family, parents and 3 children. The family appeared to be carrying personal belongings and seemed to be preparing for travel. The brothers loaded the family into their sled and began the journey back toward town. Dr. Hartwell and Janet followed at a careful distance, expecting to see the family delivered to safety in Hayes. Instead, the brothers' sled went directly to their warehouse. The family was led inside, and the building was secured. Dr. Hartwell and Janet waited for hours, expecting the family to emerge, but by dawn there was no sign of them. The only activity was the continuous operation of the furnace, which appeared to be burning with unusual intensity. Convinced they had witnessed the abduction of the Kowalski family, Dr. Hartwell and Janet returned to town to gather their fellow investigators. They understood they could no longer wait for outside authorities. They had to act immediately to save the Kowalski family and stop any further deaths. The group decided to confront the Parker brothers directly, demanding an explanation for the Kowalski family's disappearance and presenting the evidence of the brothers' suspicious activities. They approached the warehouse on the morning of February 23, armed with their documentation and prepared for a direct confrontation. Thomas Parker met them at the warehouse door, maintaining his characteristic calm. When asked about the Kowalski family, he explained that they had been suffering from severe frostbite and malnutrition and that he and Samuel had transported them to relatives in Junction City. He offered detailed explanations for every one of the investigators' concerns, dismissing their evidence as misunderstandings and coincidences. However, Dr. Hartwell made a critical observation during this confrontation. As Thomas Parker spoke, the doctor noticed stains on the man's clothing that appeared to be blood. When he pointed this out, Thomas claimed he had been butchering livestock for food preparation. But Dr. Hartwell, drawing on his medical training, recognized that the stains were consistent with human blood rather than animal blood. The confrontation escalated when Janet Thornfield demanded to search the warehouse for evidence of the Kowalski family's presence. Thomas Parker refused outright, claiming the building contained sensitive materials and contaminated items that posed serious health risks. But his refusal only intensified the investigators' suspicions and convinced them that their worst fears were entirely justified. Unable to gain voluntary access to the warehouse, the group turned to what remained of the local authorities. They approached Deputy Marshal Tom Brennan, presenting their evidence and demanding an official investigation. Initially skeptical, Brennan was eventually persuaded by the weight of the accumulated evidence and the urgency of the situation. On February 25, 1900, Deputy Marshal Brennan, accompanied by Dr. Hartwell and 3 other volunteers, forced entry into the Parker brothers' warehouse. What they found inside would become the subject of official reports, criminal proceedings, and decades of subsequent investigation. The warehouse was divided into several distinct sections, each serving a different purpose in the brothers' operation. The main area contained hundreds of personal items, clothing, furniture, tools, and household goods organized with meticulous precision. Every item was cataloged and tagged, suggesting a highly systematic approach to inventory management. In a separate room, the investigators found detailed records of the brothers' activities. These documents included property maps, family information, financial records, and correspondence related to estate transactions. The level of detail was staggering. The brothers had maintained comprehensive files on virtually every family in the area, including information about their resources, vulnerabilities, and potential value. Most disturbing were the personal effects that should have been buried alongside the deceased families. The investigators discovered jewelry, family photographs, religious items, and other possessions that families would never have surrendered voluntarily. These items were sorted and cataloged like merchandise, with notes indicating their estimated value and resale potential. The furnace area yielded the most horrifying evidence of all. The brothers had modified their furnace to operate at extremely high temperatures, capable of completely consuming organic material. Surrounding the furnace, the investigators found bone fragments, partially burned clothing, and other remains suggesting the brothers had been using the furnace to dispose of human bodies. Dr. Hartwell collected samples of the bone fragments and other organic materials for analysis. His medical examination confirmed the remains were human, representing multiple individuals of varying ages. The doctor estimated the furnace had been used to dispose of dozens of bodies, possibly more than 100, over the course of the winter months. The investigators also uncovered evidence of the brothers' most recent activities. In a locked room, they found the personal belongings of the Kowalski family, including the children's toys and the parents' clothing. The items were arranged as if recently sorted and catalogued, suggesting the family had been processed within the past few days. Most chilling of all was a journal kept by Samuel Parker, which contained detailed descriptions of the brothers' methods and personal philosophy. The journal revealed that the brothers had gradually constructed their system over several years, perfecting their techniques and justifying their actions through a twisted internal logic of mercy and efficiency. When confronted with the evidence found in their warehouse, the Parker brothers initially attempted to maintain their innocence, insisting they had been operating a legitimate estate service and that any irregularities were simply the result of the extreme winter conditions. However, the overwhelming physical evidence and the testimony of multiple witnesses made their guilt impossible to deny. Thomas Parker, the elder brother, eventually provided a partial confession in exchange for assurance that his younger brother would be spared execution. His confession revealed the full scope of their activities and provided details about their methods, motivations, and the number of families they had killed. According to Thomas's confession, the brothers had eliminated 47 families during the winter of 1899 to 1900, representing approximately 200 individual victims. They had begun their activities as a response to the extreme conditions, initially targeting families already near death from cold and starvation. However, as their system grew more refined and profitable, they had shifted to actively seeking out healthy families with valuable properties. The brothers had developed sophisticated methods for luring families to their warehouse, often claiming they had located relatives who could provide help or that they needed assistance with estate matters. Once a family was inside the warehouse, they would be overpowered and killed, usually by suffocation or blunt force trauma, chosen specifically to minimize blood evidence. Bodies were then processed through their modified furnace, which could completely consume human remains within several hours. Personal belongings were sorted and catalogued, with valuable items retained for resale and everything else destroyed. The brothers had created an elaborate system of false documentation to explain the family's disappearances and to facilitate the illegal transfer of their properties. Samuel Parker, the younger brother, provided additional details about their psychological state during the winter. He described how they had gradually become desensitized to the killing, coming to view it as a necessary business function rather than murder. He claimed they had convinced themselves they were providing a service to the community by preventing slow deaths from starvation and exposure. The brothers' trial became one of the most notorious criminal proceedings in Kansas history. The evidence against them was overwhelming, including physical remains, documented confessions, and testimony from multiple witnesses. The trial laid bare the full scope of their crimes and offered insight into the psychological mechanisms that had enabled such systematic murder. Both brothers were convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. However, the legal proceedings were complicated by questions of jurisdiction, the extreme circumstances of the winter, and the challenges of proving specific crimes when so much evidence had already been destroyed. The discovery of the Parker brothers' crimes sent shockwaves throughout Kansas and the broader region. The systematic nature of their murders, the sophisticated methods they had employed, and the sheer number of victims made their case entirely unique in American criminal history. The trial proceedings were covered extensively in newspapers throughout the Midwest, and the case became a subject of study for criminologists and legal scholars alike. The immediate aftermath of the discovery created serious problems for the community of Hayes. The brothers' activities had cost the town a significant portion of its population, and many property ownership records had been falsified or destroyed outright. Legal proceedings continued for years as authorities attempted to determine the rightful owners of properties that had been illegally transferred. The case also raised difficult questions about community responsibility and the systems that had allowed such crimes to go undetected for so long. Many residents struggled with guilt over their failure to recognize the warning signs and blamed themselves for extending trust to the brothers despite subtle red flags. Dr. Hartwell, who had played a pivotal role in exposing the brothers, was profoundly affected by the experience. His medical journal entries from the period reveal a man wrestling with the psychological weight of discovering such systematic evil within his own community. He continued to practice medicine in Hayes but never fully recovered from the trauma of the investigation. Janet Thornfield, the boarding house operator who had first suspected the brothers, became something of a local hero for her persistence and courage. However, she also carried the painful knowledge that earlier intervention might have saved lives. She continued to live in Hayes until her death in 1934, always maintaining detailed records of community activities and remaining vigilant for any signs of similar crimes. The case had broader implications for law enforcement and community oversight. It demonstrated how extreme circumstances could provide cover for criminal activity and underscored the importance of maintaining official oversight even during crisis situations. The case became a standard example in police academies and law schools, used to illustrate how systematic criminals could exploit community trust in extraordinary circumstances alike. Despite the extensive investigation, trial proceedings, and years of subsequent research, many questions about the Parker brothers' crimes remain unanswered. The true number of victims may never be known, as the brothers' records were incomplete and much of the evidence was destroyed in their furnace. Some estimates suggest the number of victims could have been significantly higher than the 47 families mentioned in Thomas Parker's confession. The brothers' backgrounds and the origins of their criminal behavior remain largely mysterious. Despite exhaustive investigation, authorities were never able to determine definitively whether the brothers had committed similar crimes before arriving in Hayes, or whether their activities were solely the product of the opportunities they found in frontier communities. Some evidence suggests they may have been involved in suspicious activities elsewhere, but no definitive connections were ever established. The fate of certain families remains unknown. While the brothers confessed to killing 47 families, records suggest additional families disappeared during the winter without explanation. Some may have died from natural causes or fled to other locations, but the possibility remains that the brothers' activities were even more extensive than they ever admitted. The psychological dimensions of the case continue to captivate researchers and criminologists. The brothers' ability to maintain their facade of respectability while committing systematic murder raises deep questions about the nature of evil and the factors that can drive otherwise ordinary individuals to commit extraordinary crimes. Their use of religious and charitable justifications for their actions offers disturbing insight into the psychological mechanisms criminals use to rationalize their behavior. The case also raises broader questions about the nature of community and the systems that hold societies together. The residents of Hayes had trusted the Parker brothers based on their reputation and apparent respectability, demonstrating how criminals can exploit social trust and community bonds to facilitate their crimes. The case stands as a sobering reminder that vigilance and healthy skepticism are necessary even within the closest knit of communities. The Parker brothers were executed on October 15, 1900, at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. Their deaths brought legal closure to one of the most horrific crime sprees in American history, but the impact of their actions continued to ripple through the community of Hayes and the broader region for decades to come. The case remains one of the most extensively documented examples of systematic murder in American criminal history. The surviving records, including court transcripts, witness testimonies, and physical evidence, provide a comprehensive window into how two individuals were able to exploit extreme circumstances to commit crimes of unprecedented scope and brutality. The story of the Parker brothers serves as a permanent reminder of the potential for evil lurking within seemingly normal communities and the critical importance of maintaining vigilance even in times of crisis. Their crimes demonstrated how rapidly social bonds can unravel under extreme pressure and how criminals can exploit community trust to carry out their darkest ambitions. Today, the site of the Parker brothers' warehouse in Hayes, Kansas, is marked by a simple memorial to the victims of their crimes. The memorial stands as a reminder of the importance of community vigilance and the enduring responsibility to protect the most vulnerable members of society, even during times of extreme hardship. The case continues to be studied by criminologists, historians, and legal scholars as a defining example of how extreme circumstances can provide cover for criminal activity and how communities, working together, can expose and stop such crimes. The investigation that led to the brothers' capture stands as a testament to the power of citizen involvement in law enforcement and the strength of collective action in the face of evil. This story reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there are always individuals willing to stand up for justice and shield their communities from harm. The courage of Janet Thornfield, Dr. Hartwell, and the other investigators who exposed the Parker brothers' crimes continues to serve as an inspiration for all who face difficult moral choices in their own lives. Even after the brothers' execution, disturbing discoveries continued to surface throughout Hayes and the surrounding areas. In March 1901, nearly a year after the trials had concluded, construction workers renovating the basement of the old Methodist church found a collection of personal items hidden beneath the floorboards. The cache included jewelry, family photographs, children's toys, and religious artifacts matching descriptions of belongings from families the Parker brothers had claimed to process. The most chilling discovery of all was a leather-bound ledger that appeared to contain detailed records of the brothers' activities dating back to 1897, 2 full years before the infamous winter. The ledger entries were written in a coded system that took investigators months to decipher, but once translated, they revealed that the brothers had been systematically eliminating isolated families far longer than anyone had suspected. According to the coded entries, the brothers had killed at least 15 families during the winters of 1897 and 1898, perfecting their methods and building their confidence before launching the massive killing spree of 1899. The entries described their techniques in clinical detail, including how they had learned to dispose of bodies completely, how to forge property documents, and how to manipulate community perceptions of their activities. The ledger also contained disturbing psychological insights into the brothers' mindset. Thomas Parker had written extensive justifications for their actions, describing their victims as burdens on society and claiming they were performing a kind of natural selection by eliminating the weak and vulnerable. Samuel Parker's entries were more practical in nature, focused on the logistics of their operations and the financial returns of their crimes. Most horrifying were the entries that documented the brothers' experiments with different killing methods. They had tested various approaches to murder, searching for techniques that were efficient, quiet, and left minimal evidence. The ledger revealed that they had initially turned to poison obtained from agricultural supplies, but had ultimately settled on suffocation and blunt force trauma as their preferred methods. The discovery of the ledger forced authorities to reopen their investigation and reconsider the full scope of the brothers' crimes. The revelation that they had been killing families for at least 3 years meant the total number of victims could have exceeded 300 people, placing their case among the most extensive serial killing sprees in American history. As news of the additional evidence spread, several individuals came forward with accounts that cast new light on the brothers' activities. These testimonies, collected by state investigators between 1901 and 1903, painted a picture of a criminal enterprise operating with shocking efficiency and cold-blooded deception. Margaret Kowalski, the sole surviving member of the family that Dr. Hartwell and Janet Thornfield had watched being taken to the warehouse, provided the most detailed account of the brothers' methods. Margaret had been visiting relatives in Junction City when her family was eliminated and returned to Hayes in the spring of 1900 to discover that her entire family had supposedly died of exposure. Her testimony revealed that the brothers had been planning her family's elimination for months, waiting carefully for the right moment when she would be absent. According to Margaret, the brothers had visited her family repeatedly throughout the autumn of 1899, offering assistance with winter preparations and gradually earning the family's trust. They had supplied the family with contaminated heating fuel that burned inefficiently, forcing them to depend on the brothers for additional supplies. They had also spread rumors around town that the Kowalski family was suffering from a contagious disease, effectively isolating them from any potential help. Margaret's testimony also revealed that the brothers had been systematically poisoning isolated families with small doses of arsenic obtained from agricultural supplies. This poison weakened their victims and made them more susceptible to cold and disease, manufacturing conditions that would make their deaths appear entirely natural. The brothers would then offer to assist the weakened families, ultimately luring them to the warehouse for elimination. Another crucial account came from Henry Kellerman, Mary Kellerman's brother, who had briefly worked as a part-time employee for the Parker brothers during the winter of 1899. Henry had been hired to assist with what he believed was legitimate estate-clearing work, but he had witnessed activities that troubled him at the time and horrified him once he understood their true nature. Henry described being present when the brothers processed the belongings of recently eliminated families. He had watched them sort through personal items with cold efficiency, separating valuable objects from sentimental possessions. The brothers had shown particular interest in family photographs and documents, which they would study carefully before feeding to the furnace. Most disturbing was Henry's account of the brothers' conversations during these sessions. They would discuss their victims with casual indifference, referring to them by their property values rather than by their names. Thomas Parker would often comment on the efficiency of their operations, expressing quiet satisfaction with how cleanly they had eliminated entire families without leaving a trace of evidence. Henry also provided details about the brothers' disposal methods. He had helped them carry what he believed were bundles of contaminated clothing and bedding to the furnace, but now understood those bundles had almost certainly contained human remains. The brothers had been meticulous about ensuring nothing identifiable survived the burning process, often grinding down bone fragments and mixing them with ash before final disposal. The full revelation of the Parker brothers' crimes created a crisis of faith within the community of Hayes. Residents struggled to comprehend how such systematic evil had operated in their midst for years without detection. The discovery that the brothers had been killing families for 3 years before their mass murder spree of 1899 raised painful questions about community responsibility and the warning signs that had been overlooked or ignored. Church leaders organized special prayer services and community meetings to help residents process the trauma of what had been revealed. The Methodist minister, Reverend William Hartwell, Dr. Hartwell's own brother, delivered a series of sermons about the nature of evil and the necessity of community vigilance. These sermons, preserved in the church archives, provide a window into how a religious community grappled with the existence of such calculated evil in its midst. The economic impact of the crimes continued to reverberate throughout the region. The brothers had illegally acquired vast amounts of property and possessions, creating a tangled web of false ownership that took years to unravel. Many legitimate property owners were forced into lengthy legal battles to reclaim what was rightfully theirs, and some properties were never successfully returned to their original owners or their heirs. The case also had sweeping implications for frontier communities throughout the American West. The Parker brothers' crimes demonstrated just how vulnerable isolated communities could be to systematic predators who exploited the trust and mutual dependence that frontier life demanded. Other communities began implementing new procedures for monitoring estate services and tracking population changes to guard against similar crimes. State authorities established new protocols for investigating suspicious deaths and disappearances in rural areas. These protocols required multiple witnesses for death certifications, mandatory medical examinations of bodies, and detailed documentation of all property transfers. The Parker Protocols, as they came to be known, were adopted by several Western states and remained in use for decades afterward. The Parker brothers' case became a subject of intense interest for the emerging field of criminal psychology. Dr. Hamilton Craig, an alienist who had been studying criminal behavior at the University of Kansas, conducted extensive interviews with surviving witnesses and analyzed the brothers' writings and behavioral patterns at length. His findings, published in 1904, provided one of the first comprehensive psychological profiles of systematic murderers ever produced. Dr. Craig's analysis revealed that the Parker brothers had displayed hallmark signs of what would later be termed psychopathic behavior. They had demonstrated a complete absence of empathy for their victims, viewing them as objects to be exploited rather than human beings with inherent worth. Their ability to maintain facades of respectability while committing systematic murder indicated sophisticated psychological manipulation skills that few could have anticipated. The brothers had also shown remarkable adaptability in their criminal methods, constantly refining their techniques based on experience and shifting circumstances. This adaptability, combined with their capacity for long-term planning, suggested high intelligence and organizational ability channeled entirely toward criminal ends. Most intriguingly, Dr. Craig's analysis proposed that the brothers had developed a shared delusion that served to justify their actions in their own minds. They had persuaded themselves that they were performing a beneficial service by eliminating families who would otherwise suffer slow deaths from starvation and exposure. This psychological mechanism had allowed them to commit mass murder while somehow preserving a positive self-image. The brothers' writings also revealed a gradual escalation in their criminal thinking. Their earliest entries showed some dim awareness that their actions were wrong, but later entries demonstrated complete moral detachment from their crimes. This progression shed light on how individuals might gradually become desensitized to extreme violence through repeated exposure and relentless psychological justification. Dr. Craig's work on the Parker brothers' case contributed significantly to the early development of criminal psychology theory and influenced how law enforcement approached the investigation of systematic crimes going forward. His findings suggested that criminals like the Parker brothers could be identified through careful observation of behavioral patterns and psychological characteristics, a foundational idea in what would later become criminal profiling. The most shocking discovery connected to the Parker brothers' crimes didn't surface until 1907, nearly 7 years after their execution. During the demolition of an old barn on the outskirts of Hayes, workers uncovered a hidden chamber that contained additional evidence of the brothers' activities. The chamber had been carefully concealed behind a false wall and held items that offered new insight into the true scope of their crimes. The hidden chamber contained hundreds of personal items belonging to the brothers' victims, including jewelry, photographs, religious artifacts, and family documents. The items were organized with meticulous care, suggesting the brothers had maintained this collection as some form of trophy room or private record of their crimes. Most disturbing were the detailed maps and diagrams showing the locations of unmarked graves throughout the region. These documents revealed that the brothers had not always relied on their furnace to dispose of bodies. In certain cases, they had buried victims in remote locations, marking the grave sites for their own future reference. The maps led investigators to 17 additional burial sites containing the remains of 43 individuals. The discovery of these graves provided final, irrefutable confirmation of the true scope of the Parker brothers' crimes. Forensic analysis of the remains revealed that the brothers had been killing families for at least 4 years before their capture, with an estimated total of over 400 victims. This number placed their case among the most extensive serial killing sprees in world history. The grave sites also offered evidence of the brothers' psychological deterioration over time. Earlier burials showed some attempt at treating the bodies with basic dignity, but later graves reflected increasingly callous disposal methods. The brothers had gradually abandoned any pretense of respect for their victims, a shift that mirrored their complete moral detachment from their crimes. The Parker brothers' case had profound and lasting effects on American society, law enforcement, and criminal justice as a whole. The systematic nature of their crimes and the sophisticated methods they had employed challenged existing assumptions about criminal behavior and the safety of even close-knit communities. The case proved that extreme evil could exist within seemingly normal environments and that traditional social safeguards might be wholly insufficient to prevent such crimes. The legal proceedings that followed the brothers' execution established important precedents for handling cases involving systematic murder and property fraud. The complex web of false transfers and forged documents required entirely new legal frameworks for restoring stolen property to its rightful owners, frameworks that would influence property law and estate procedures for decades to come. The case also had a significant impact on the development of law enforcement techniques. The investigation that exposed the brothers' crimes demonstrated the indispensable value of community cooperation in solving complex criminal cases. The success of the citizen investigators who first suspected the brothers helped establish the principle that community members have both the right and the responsibility to report suspicious activities to the authorities. The psychological analysis of the Parker brothers contributed to the early foundations of criminal profiling. Dr. Craig's work provided a framework for understanding how systematic murderers think and operate, shaping how law enforcement would approach similar cases for generations. The case became a standard reference in criminal psychology courses and police training programs throughout the country. The community of Hayes itself was permanently changed by the revelations of the brothers' crimes. The town's population had been devastated by the murders, and many survivors carried the weight of trauma and guilt for decades. The community developed new traditions and institutions designed to preserve the memory of the victims and guard against any similar crimes in the future. A memorial park was established on the site of the Parker brothers' warehouse, featuring monuments to the victims and educational displays on the importance of community vigilance. The park became a place of remembrance and quiet reflection, helping the community process its collective trauma and honor the memory of those who had been taken from them. Despite the extensive investigation, prosecution, and years of ongoing research, some aspects of the Parker brothers' case remain shrouded in mystery. The true number of victims may never be definitively known, as the brothers' records were incomplete and enormous quantities of evidence were destroyed in their furnace. Some estimates suggest the number could have been higher still than the confirmed 400 victims, making their case possibly the most extensive serial killing spree in recorded human history. The brothers' backgrounds and the origins of their criminal behavior remain only partially understood. Despite exhaustive investigation, authorities were never able to determine definitively whether the brothers had committed similar crimes before arriving in Kansas, or whether their activities arose solely from the opportunities they found in frontier communities. Some evidence hints at involvement in suspicious activities elsewhere, but no definitive connections were ever established. The psychological dimensions of the case continue to fascinate researchers. The brothers' ability to live double lives, appearing as helpful and respected community members while secretly eliminating families, raises profound questions about the nature of evil and the factors that can lead individuals to commit extraordinary crimes. Their case serves as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear the most trustworthy. The winter of 1899 in Kansas was indeed the coldest ever recorded. But the actions of the Parker brothers created a cold that reached far deeper than any thermometer could measure. A cold that touched the very soul of a community and reminded everyone who heard the story that evil can hide behind the most respectable of facades. What they burned in their furnace was indeed far more than wood. It was human life, human dignity, and the very trust that holds communities together. Yet the story of the Parker brothers is not ultimately a story about the triumph of evil. It is a story about the power of community vigilance and individual courage to expose and stop even the most calculated criminal enterprise. The investigation that led to their capture stands as proof that ordinary citizens, working together with determination and moral clarity, can overcome even the most sophisticated criminal operations. The case remains a permanent reminder that freedom and safety demand constant vigilance, and that every member of a community carries a responsibility to protect its most vulnerable. The courage of Janet Thornfield, Dr. Hartwell, and the other investigators who brought the Parker brothers to justice continues to inspire all those who face difficult moral choices in their own lives. Today, more than a century after the Parker brothers' execution, their case remains one of the most extensively studied examples of systematic murder in all of criminal history. The lessons drawn from their crimes continue to shape law enforcement practices, criminal psychology, and community safety standards. Their story stands as an enduring reminder that even in the darkest moments of human history, truth and justice can ultimately prevail over the most calculated evil. Just when we thought we had seen the full extent of the horror in Hayes, the story grows darker still. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Let's uncover together what else lies buried in the annals of American crime. This mystery reminds us that evil can hide behind the most respectable of facades and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. What do you make of this story? Do you believe everything has finally been revealed, or do you think there are more victims out there whose stories will never be told? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this and want more stories like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves a good mystery. The truth is always more terrifying than fiction, and there are more stories waiting to be uncovered. See you in the next one.